According to recent polling commissioned by the Broadbent Institute, millennials believe that the gap between the rich and the poor will grow over their lifetime. They think that they will face a future of precarious work. They are more likely than boomers to believe that they will be out of work for long periods of time. And only a third of them believe that they will own a home at the time of their retirement. Their parents are also worried. Almost a majority of their parents believe that economic opportunities for their children are worse today than they were when they were the same age. Boomers fear that their children's generation won't be able to raise the tax revenue necessary to pay for social programs when they retire. Unfortunately, the plight of millennials has become a joke to many. Reduced to a stereotype, they are the failure to launch generation, living with mom and dad forever. Never growing up, filled with high expectations and no experience. It's a damning description, and if only it was true, it'd be simple to write them off. Others would have you believe that millennials are faring poorly because boomers are doing so well, that their piece of the pie is too big, and when young Canadians are looking for someone to blame, they should point the finger at an older generation. But these are convenient stories that encourage apathy and infighting while letting the government off the hook. I would ask you to reject the suggestion that young Canadians find themselves in low-paying jobs, lacking stability and benefits, unable to afford housing and save for the future, crippled by student debt because of their own hubris or because of the failures of their parents. Now, it is true that the legacy of spending and policy building of the 1960s and 70s has not materialized for generations growing up in the 90s and the 2000s. But rather than picking intergenerational battles, this session asks the question about how the government is failing young people and what can be done. We've asked the panelists to share what they believe are the challenges facing Canadian young people and their vision for a path forward, and how we can address these concerns. How this is going to work is that I'm going to introduce all of them at once. We're going to run it. I suggested that we run it a little bit like Sally Jesse Raphael. But when I told Max that, he said he had no idea what that was. And so we're going to run it, I guess, a little bit more like Ellen DeGeneres, or Wendy Williams, if you please. I'm going to introduce them all at once, and they're going to make statements for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a series of questions that I've arranged for them for about 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you to continue the dialogue. First up on my right is Sean Goby. Sean is currently a doctoral candidate with the University of Waterloo and a fellow with the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience. He is a research associate with the CCPA and an author of their recent report, The Young and the Jobless, Youth Unemployment in Ontario. He has played key roles in founding organizations such as Sustainable Waterloo Region, the Laurier Students' Public Interest Research Group, and I'm sure he could tell us lots of stories about being the chair of Fair Vote Canada's National Caucus. Mac FineDay is from Sweetgrass First Nation and is currently a fourth-year student majoring in political studies. He was elected president of the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union for 2013, and I know for a fact that he was just re-elected 2 days ago, so I'd like you to join me in congratulating Max. He told me after the victory party he slept for 1 hour and then got on the plane and got over here. Academically, he's focused on post-secondary education policy in Saskatchewan and abroad, as well as First Nations policy and First Nations provincial and federal politics. On my left, Gabriel Bran Lopez is founding president of Youth Fusion and co-founder of First Robotics Quebec. He's a spokesperson for the Quebec Entrepreneurship Contest and a governor on the board of the Bardier Foundation. He has just finished hosting a 3-day robotics festival that welcomed 5,000 people to prepare at-risk youth in science and technology fields. And I also know that he's had very little sleep, so this should be a lot of fun. And finally, on my far left, and probably in more ways than one, is Johanna Uggerman, who's joined us all the way from Germany. Johanna is a German politician with the Social Democratic Party, and since 2013, she's been the national chairwoman of the Young Socialists. So I'm going to ask, congratulations. I'm going to ask Sean to kick it off.
Great, thank you. So I think a really useful way to start thinking about a new deal for young Canadians is to actually take a moment to remember what the old deal was. Now, this is going to sound a bit like an old Looney Tunes cartoon that some of you might have seen, but basically the model of the mid-20th century welfare state Fordist model was that we had mass production, and to support mass production, we had mass employment, and to support that mass employment, and those folks who were employed en masse, provided all the consumer power that let us have mass production. Pretty simple, positive cycle. And the problem that we are seeing right now is that that cycle is starting to break down. And I think a good reason why that's the case is because we have kind of forgotten the other pieces that underpinned it. So when we have that mass employment, the productivity growth that came about from those workers, a lot of it came from the fact that they and their employers were tied together for a fairly long period of time. That's one of the advantages that you have from a large portion of the workforce being covered by collective bargaining agreements, is that people were employed for a long time, and that gave incentives for companies to invest in the training and development of their employees. And by investing in that training and development of employees, you could then invest in new capital, new technology, new equipment to further increase production and support this positive feedback loop. Well, also underpinning that were welfare state policies, healthcare, spending on infrastructure, spending on education, that, to use a term that was denigrated a bit this morning for fairly good reason, kind of de-risked that long-term employment contract because the state helped pay for illness and injury coverage if that were to happen to folks who were on the job. All this together did mean that companies would invest in workers. Investment in workers increased productivity, increased output, increased production, increased consumption, seemed to work. But then with globalization and also with advances in information and communication technology, the centralized mass production that brought all that together has sort of been kind of on its way out. Now, as a starting point for a conversation about youth, this might seem like a bit of a non sequitur, but it's not, because the fall in youth employment and the fall in full-time employment for youth and its replacement with part-time work, quite often involuntary part-time work, temporary work, underskilled work, really puts young people as the canaries in the coal mine. What happens to the youth today happens to all of us in the future. And I think what we really need to do is come to terms with this massive economic change away from the mass production society in a way that doesn't just let all the risk fall onto those people who have been cast aside by what used to be seen as mainstream employment. With rising tuition rates and an emphasis on what's usually called personal responsibility for young people, what it really just amounts to is that we have privatized the risks for being a part of the workforce onto some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Now, moving forward, I think we really have to think not just to how can we hold on to those parts of the old deal that we used to have, but how can we create a new one? And I think there are really three really obvious places that we can look to for where we can draw lessons. First is that we can look to the past. Mass production, that sort of mode of working, has not been ubiquitous throughout human history. In many ways, that was sort of a mid-20th century phenomenon. And the early trade union movement, particularly the craft union movement, I think has a lot of lessons to teach us about how workers in new industries can be organized in a way that will create incentives to reinvest in their training and development in the long term. And we've already seen in many ways a rediscovery of some other cooperative forms of mutual aid, such as a revitalization of the credit union movement. I think we also need to look sideways. We need to look to other countries that are responding to this challenge in different ways than what we're doing. The challenges of youth employment are hitting the entire OECD, and in many ways we're faring better than some and worse than others. And I'm very pleased that we have someone from Germany here to be able to speak to us, given that they have some of the lowest youth unemployment rates in the world. And finally, we need to look to the future, to tomorrow, forward, for some new tools for mutual organizing that were never possible until now. For example, I really am excited by the prospect of collaborative consumption and crowdfunding as ways that we can support revitalizing old industries or creating new ones. I mean, those sources of employment, that overall framework, I think, is something we can push forward. Now, all this being said, there is a strong role for government in all of these places. I don't think we're entirely clear yet what that's going to look like in its entirety in the future, but I think that we have a lot of the lessons that we can learn at our fingertips going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Max.
Tuau kakio na sigatsun kisagao pisim wasis e guawi kaskotinia. So I'm the guy that doesn't know who Sally Jesse Raphael is. Okay. I have to say, I'm becoming that age, you know, it's the panel on young people, right? If it's before Nintendo 64, I don't remember it. Before I begin, I just have to acknowledge the territory we're on, the unceded and unsurrendered territory that we're on. And I'd like to acknowledge the chiefs who came and welcomed us here today. So my name is Max FineDay. I'm from the Sweetgrass First Nation, and I'm president of the University of Saskatchewan Students' Union. And I'm here to talk about what a new deal for young people in Canada can look like. And I think that's a really exciting topic. It's so hopeful, and I think it's so timely, because we know that what's happening in Canada right now for young people isn't working, and that Canada is not living up to its full potential. So I come from the student movement, where my colleagues and I, fellow students, sit around and talk about how we can make education more affordable and how we can make education more accessible for our peers. Unfortunately, we're often seeing the opposite. Governments across the country are disinvesting from post-secondary education. Tuition is continually rising, and where I'm from, the University of Saskatchewan, students are often paying more but getting much less because of program cuts and support service cuts. But I do believe there are reasons to be hopeful. You know, we had some news coming out of Newfoundland and Labrador the other day where, thanks to a strong network of student activists and strong opposition from the NDP, the government will be investing over $14 million to convert provincial student loans into grants for those in need. Yeah, that's hopeful. My own work in advocacy at the University of Saskatchewan has allowed for the provincial government to invest in open educational resources, open textbooks in this case, where textbooks are placed online for professors and students to access for free, which saves students hundreds of dollars a semester on one of the highest costs of post-secondary. So those are good first steps. It's certainly not everything, and there's certainly more work that we need to do. I also come from the First Nations movement. I've been to rallies and protests all of my life. I'm a bit of a rabble-rouser. My parents made sure that they instilled in me a sense of pride and a sense of duty to speak up for my nation, and I'm so incredibly thankful for that. When we're talking about a New Deal, we know that young Aboriginals are often at the heartbreaking end of every statistic that we have in Canada, whether it be the high levels of poverty and suicide or the low levels of education completion or health. We also know that the First Nations movement still suffers from a lot of racism in Canada. When you read the comments of any news story that has to do with Aboriginal people, and I suggest that you don't, you always have at least one of our neighbors demanding to know why Aboriginals aren't working, and then they usually decide for themselves that it is because of all the handouts that are given. The truth is, it's not handouts that have failed Aboriginal people. It is Canada who has failed Aboriginal peoples and continue to fail Aboriginal youth every day. Right now, we are living in poverty in the midst of plenty. We are living in continued colonialism and capitalism, neither of which have done any favors for Aboriginal people. I just want to mention this weekend is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is in Edmonton for their final national event. I have so much respect for the 3 commissioners, and I have so much respect for those who are going to tell their stories. I have so much respect and love for my own father, who survived residential schools, all of the abuse, and who watched many of his peers and his friends die or be murdered in the schools. But my father kept the language and the ceremonies and never gave up. Any deal that we have for Aboriginal youth has to include what we have, the traditions, the ceremonies, the language, the things I just spoke of, and it has to include allyship and action, because there will be no reconciliation until the truth is heard and acted upon. Canada has shown that it's been a bad boyfriend, often writing reports and a royal commission only to continue the abuse. I met Jack Layton once. He said, "Hello, young man. Thank you for coming out to the event. What do you do?" I started talking about my work with First Nations youth and the hopelessness that often I see and that is often in our First Nations communities. It was such a powerful moment. He looked at me. There were thousands of people in the room. I'm sure hundreds of people trying to talk to him. Sorry, I'm not that popular. And he said to me, "There is always hope." And he said to me, "First Nations poverty should never be an accepted part of life." And that's our call to action. That's our call to action. Aboriginal youth will have no prosperity, economic or otherwise, until they have something to be hopeful about. Now, much of that has to come from within the community, and much of that has to come from government action. But as progressives, we're losing to mining companies and environmentally unsustainable corporations who take the time to invest in communities and peoples. And there has to be a much better effort and reflection inside of our own groups and our own movements about how to partner with Aboriginal people and struggles. And that's the beginnings of a new deal. Thank you so much.
Donc, bonjour à tous. Mon nom est Gabriel. Je viens de Montréal, du Québec. As mentioned, I founded 2 organizations. The first one is called Youth Fusion. And Youth Fusion works with over 8,500 at-risk youth on a daily basis to keep them in school, so our role is to lower dropout rates. And I also co-founded an organization called First Robotics Quebec that works with over 3,500 youth to prepare them and encourage them to study in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so when you ask me what are the challenges facing Canadian youth today, I will say education. 6 years ago, I was called by 12 principals from different schools, and they asked me to be a keynote speaker in front of their kids to talk about school perseverance, about the importance of staying in school, about student engagement. And so in over 3 months, I spoke to about 10,000 kids, and each presentation would last about 75 minutes. And I would speak for about 60 minutes, and at the end, I would save 15 minutes to ask one question to the kids. I would say, now that I've told you about what kept me in school, what would you like to see in your school to stay engaged, to stay motivated? And many kids came up to the microphones and said, well, first of all, we're tired of guest speakers like you. I'm not kidding, they actually said this. And I said, why? Why do you say this? And they said, because we're tired of people coming here for an hour for a presentation or for a workshop, and then they're gone. There's no follow-up, there's no tools that we can keep, it's just you, blah, 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 and then it's gone. And that really shocked me. And it's what led to the creation of Youth Fusion, the organization that I lead. And then 2 years later, the Canadian Education Association published a report called What Did You Do in School Today? And the report revealed that across Canada, only 37% of Canadian youth felt intellectually engaged in learning. So if you ask me again, what is the main issue facing Canadian youth today, I would say education. But if you ask me what is the main issue facing Canada today, I will say dropout rates. And to me, dropping out of school is definitely a tragedy. Every kid who does not complete secondary school lacks the fundamental skills to thrive in our fast-paced, information-rich society. And yet, despite the fact that we're one of the richest countries on the face of the earth, we have schools in Aboriginal settings where we work, schools in big cities that see dropout rates as high as 50%, as 90%. And so, like I said, it is a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. But dropping out of school is also an economical tragedy and a societal tragedy. And yes, I'm saying it, but there's proven documents and statistical facts that demonstrate that it is indeed an economical crisis and a societal tragedy. And so on the economical side, I'd like to share 5 examples with you. The first one is about income. The second one is about unemployment. The third one is about imprisonment. The fourth one is about health. And the fifth one is about overall cost to society. So the first one, income level. There's proof that shows that dropouts earn less money on a yearly basis and obviously throughout the course of their lifetime. The second one, unemployment. Dropouts have an unemployment rate that is twice as high. It's 7% for graduates and about 15% for dropouts. Imprisonment. Dropouts have a share of prison population of about 63% as opposed to 37% for graduates. On the health level, dropouts have poorer health, which obviously leads to social assistance, which costs money, as you know. And on my fifth example, like I said, it's about the overall cost on society. There's a study that shows that a cohort of dropouts costs about $1.9 billion to the government. $1.9 billion, that is a lot of money if you think about it. That's for the economical side. On the societal tragedy side, I have 2 examples. The first one is about life expectancy, and the second one is about citizen participation. It is proven that the average life expectancy of a dropout is obviously shorter of about 7 years. That's one aspect. The second one is about citizen participation. It is proven that at the volunteering level, so people who volunteer, dropouts are about 9% of the equation, and university graduates are about 43% of the equation. At the donation of blood, 2% of dropouts donate blood. University graduates, about 9%. And when we talk about voting and the voting turnout, 52% of dropouts will vote, as opposed to 84% of university graduates who will vote. So if we're not seeing the democratic deficit in these stats, I don't know what will demonstrate it. So like I said, dropping out of school is to me one of the biggest challenges. But once we get them into post-secondary education, whether it is vocational schools, colleges, or universities, there's also other issues that we're facing. And I want to end with these 3 examples. First of all, once they make it to those schools, to those universities, how do we encourage them to study in fields where we as a society have a shortage of skilled workers, like in science and technology? My second example is, after they graduate, how do we make sure that these recent grads, these young, bright minds that we have trained on our soil in Canada, how do we make sure that they stay here and that they pursue careers in our country, in our big cities? There's a report being published in Montreal right now that shows that even though Montreal has as many students as Boston, we're losing them. They're going to other countries. The people that we train in our beautiful, brilliant universities are going away to other countries to create jobs in other countries. So how do we retain them here? And my third example is, how do we promote entrepreneurship? Instead of looking at young people as people who are seeking jobs, how do we help them create jobs, their own job, and how do we help them create jobs for others? How do we help them launch their own startups that are going to create the jobs that don't exist today, but that in 5 years will be top jobs? And so keeping kids in school And promoting entrepreneurship or promoting these fields of studies is not just the role of government, it's not just the role of corporations or of universities. It's also the role of everybody in this room, no matter where you come from. And there's that old saying that says, it takes a village to bring up a child. Well, I tell you, it takes a whole village to bring up a young leader. And we're all in that village. The question is, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing in that village? You have the answer, you have the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Okay. First of all, I really want to thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great opportunity for me to discuss with all of you these important questions, so thank you very much. I think it is indeed a critical and difficult time for millions of young people, but I also think it's the right time to rise up, to get involved, and to show political leaders that we do not accept empty promises and meaningless speeches. I think we have to make it very clear to these politicians that they will lose an entire generation if they not start to take the disaster of youth unemployment seriously. And I think that's why we are here for, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I was asked to give you a short overview about how the situation of young people in Europe is, and also in Germany especially. And I will start with Europe and then come to Germany, and will this add to the Canadian perspective. When it comes to Europe, nearly 1/4 of all young Europeans is without a job or training position. And that means almost 6 million young people across the entire continent. Almost 6 million lives of disappointment and economic hardship. And with the exception of 3 countries, there is no EU member state with a youth unemployment rate below 20%. In many countries, it is well above 30%. Outright shocking is the situation in Greece and in Spain. There are more than 50% of all young people are without any job or training position. When we look from Europe, from these numbers to Germany, Germany often looks like the heaven on earth. The young unemployment rate in Germany is at 8%. But what we often forget when we think about Germany is that young people pay the price for the low unemployment rate, because they are facing problems like bad working conditions. They often have unpaid internship, they have to do unpaid extra work, they have short-time contracts, so it's not the heaven on earth, I can tell you. They are also facing a lot of problems. Not the same problems all the other Europeans do, but they're facing the problems. And what was the reaction of European leaders to the alarming situation we have in Europe and we have in Germany? The answer is neither not at all, or they act in the completely wrong way. The EU decision makers have so far cared little about the fate of young aspiring individuals. Instead, their main concern is handling the economic crisis with saving banks and protect the big business. And they spent hundreds of billions in the financial system, in stability programs, but nothing to fight youth unemployment. And one does not have to be an economic mastermind to foresee the consequences of the dogmatic politics, of the austerity politics they do. And what do states, if they have to drastically cut down their public spending? They abolish social benefits, they stop investing in infrastructure, they privatize state services and fire public employees, They end support programs for students and young artists, and they close down theaters, broadcasting stations, and they stop hiring freshly trained teachers. So what these politics seriously does not is to create new jobs and to create good working conditions for young people. And that's why we as young people from Germany and young people from Europe call for stopping this politics, stopping the Austrian politics immediately. And what we demand for is, and maybe that's also interesting for the Canadian perspective, what we demand for is a comprehensive financial stimuli across the EU to get European economics going again. And we call for sustained investments in education, in social security, and in promising future-oriented business sectors. And second, we call for a full implementation of and extension of the European Job and Training Guarantee Program. That means that every young European under 30 must receive an adequate job or training position within the first 2 months of unemployment. And finally, we call for a fundamental restructuring of all spheres of society in order to account for the needs and ambitions for young people. Young Europeans willing to start their own enterprises must be welcomed with open arms and supported financially. Across Europe, infrastructure for learning and training must be brought up to modern standards, and public administrations everywhere must stop firing their employees and instead start rehiring, especially young people. What I wanted to show you is that we definitely need a global New Deal for young people. We need a global New Deal because we are facing all the same, not the same problems, but young people are facing globally problems, and also in Germany, but in Europe and also in Canada. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. So we went on a little bit. That's okay. We started a little bit late, so I might claim that time back. I'm just getting a note saying that we only have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to ask the person who's writing me this note to let me know when we have 10 minutes left. I'm just going to ask 2 questions to try and get this conversation going, and then I'm going to throw it over to you folks. So just note that there are 2 mics right there in the aisles, and we'll get to you shortly. So I want to thank everyone for their comments. You know, I think we heard a great understanding of the situations that young people feel and face in Canada. My question for you is, why aren't programs and policies currently for young people a priority of this government and globally? And what can be done to sort of create action about that? And if young people themselves bear some of the responsibility for this lack of action? Who would like to go first?
Well, first of all, young people are not voting. The voter turnout is very low, so governments, parties don't put enough emphasis on the young people because at this point, we haven't shown, we as young people, that we do have an impact on who will win and who will lose and who will take power. Whether it is at the federal level or at the provincial level, we haven't had that impact yet. And I don't know who is young here in the audience. Everybody's young, right? But no, what I mean is governments are not putting enough emphasis on young people because we're not showing up. An impact.
Right.
We're not an influential token for them.
Sean?
I think that that's absolutely true. I think that you know, there are some systemic barriers. Obviously, you mentioned the fair vote thing because I think the fact that we have first past the post means that young people's votes tend to not count because they tend to not vote for one of the big 2 parties. But I think there is a bit more than that to it as well. I think that one of the things that's happened over basically the entirety of the lifetimes of most young people in Canada today and really around the world, is that government programs have been cut back. So much risk for illness, injury, economic up and downturns has really been put squarely on the shoulders of people as individuals. Risk has been privatized when risk used to be socialized in a way that really allowed us to each kind of weather those storms more easily. Well, when you push that much risk onto people, you stretch them thin. You make it very difficult to have the time to politically organize, the time to learn about issues and get engaged. When you're dealing with massive student debt loads, when you're dealing with working jobs that don't pay you, whoever thought that was going to be an issue, but it is. And those are the things that stretch people too thin to really get organized. That being said, I think that's fundamentally where the solution to these problems come in. These are not problems of the individual. We treat it like it is. Quite often in our discussion, that individual young people aren't working hard enough, or they're not getting out there, they're not putting their nose to the grindstone to find some employment. But this is a collective action problem. This is what we together need to work on to solve.
Max?
Yeah, I'd echo both those points. You know, one thing I've learned in my role as a student union president is that, you know, students just don't have the time to organize. Young people are finding it difficult to organize. We've suffered some austerity measures at the University of Saskatchewan, and in trying to organize around those issues, people have told me, I work 3 jobs. I can't afford to organize right now. I can't afford to miss a shift. I think one reason that the young people aren't prioritized by this government is that we're not corporations. You know, I think that the government clearly has its priorities, and young people, Aboriginal people, young Aboriginal people, why not, aren't one of those priorities.
Cool. Johanna, your experiences?
I totally agree what you have said, and I'm bored about always to hear that young people are not employable, that they're not educated enough, that they're not flexible enough, and things like that. Because I think, young people are motivated. They want to work there, but they don't want to work for nothing. They want a good job. They want maybe to build up a family, maybe to rent their own houses. But the working conditions definitely have to improve.
Mm-hmm. So they do that. So there's this kind of image that we want government to invest more in young people. We want them to invest in a lot of different things. But when governments poll people, they often say, I don't want an increase in taxes. You know, they want, in some ways, they want less government in their lives. And I told everyone on the panel that I would ask them a question based on the polling. So I hope that they did their homework. In this recent Broadbent Institute poll, it shows that both millennials and boomers show strong support for the statement that they believe that they should provide for themselves and enjoy lower taxes. This is from their own poll. They also say that they believe that most people will be worse off if governments continue to withdraw services and let people go it alone. I'm going to force you to speak for your generation. How do you live with that contradiction? How do we move past those things? I mean, in some ways, the sort of tax relief thing from the States has been very successful, but how are we moving past those things? You clearly want more investments. You don't want, it's this myth that we're going to take away from the pie of boomers and just grow the pie. But how do we move past that? You have something to say, Gabriel?
I definitely do. Well, first of all, I'll be harsh on my generation. Mm-hmm. I feel as though my generation feels and thinks that society owes us everything. That's what I feel. We all saw what happened in Quebec about 2 years ago. Well, Quebec happens to have one of the lowest tuition fees at the university level, and because it was about to be increased a little, riots, among other things. It's a huge societal issue, but we feel as though, and I feel as though, and I'm speaking for myself right now, and I am, yes, being harsh on my generation, we feel as though they owe us everything. Another statement that really shocked me is that parents and children don't trust corporations to make creation of jobs a priority. I find that insulting. Why? Because we should be asking young people, do you want to create jobs? Do you want to create your own job? Are you able to create more jobs? Are you able to start your own company? Why are we not looking at wealth creation and job creation from our own point of view? What can we do? I feel as though we're always telling corporations, and I'm not here to be a pro-corporation or pro-government. No, I'm here to say it's not just the job of corporations. It's not just the job of government. It's also the job of young people to create jobs. However, I do believe that corporations and governments can contribute to startups, to projects, entrepreneurial projects that will lead to job creation, but we need to stop saying that job creation must come from corporations. No, it must come from us, from my generation. I created 135 jobs. It's not a lot, but I did create them. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Honestly, so we need to stop blaming others and start looking at what we can do to have an impact. And yes, if corporations make profits, well, they'll be able to make more donations and to invest into social programs. But if they're not making the profits, how are we going to expect them to donate anything? So I'm being harsh on my own generation, but that's just me. Attack me.
No, I don't want to attack you, but yeah, I want to mention that I don't think it's that easy.
It's not that easy.
You pointed
it is not that easy. It is not that easy.
I really hope it is, or it can be that easy, but I don't think, not every person has, the chance to create jobs or to start an enterprise, or has comes from comes from a rich family, or comes from a background.
I work with at-risk youth on a daily basis, and I don't come from a rich family at all. So I completely agree with you. I just feel as though we're just blaming others in this survey. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I understand you, but I just want to say it's not that easy. And you need the possibility, you need the opportunity, and also you need the context from the government or the I don't know the word in English, so that you can start an enterprise. So.
Sure.
Sean, if you make it quick, because we're going deep. We're going like 6 deep out here.
Oh, wow.
So I want to get to the questions.
So, I mean, I think a kind of key piece, well, a starting point is that, of course, people are going to say they want lower taxes and more spending. You ask an 8-year-old if they want ice cream and cotton candy for dinner, they'll say yes, right? Like, these things are trade-offs. They're not just independent. And that's sort of been universal. But what I will say is, the responsibility is certainly for investment isn't just on the side of government. One of the most troubling pieces that keeps coming up in my research is the withdrawal of the private sector from investment in training. The Conference Board of Canada did some work on sort of looking at what per employee expenditures on training are in this country, and it peaked in 1993. So I don't think in the past 20 years we've developed into a less sophisticated economic system. I think the problem is that a lot of companies have decided they're going to offsource all of their training requirements to colleges, universities, and high schools. And I love a lot of our public education system, but there's certain things you have to learn on the job. And if you're not willing to invest in people learning on the job, and you're trying to expect that all your hires are going to be these like ready-to-work folks right off the assembly line who are going to come in with the same level of expertise, the same level of knowledge, and the same knowledge of your industry, your products, your processes as someone who's been working on the job for 30 years, you're delusional. And a lot of corporate leaders, I think, have moved down the path to think that that's what it is we're doing. So, I mean, I think that the solutions to this problem don't just fall in the public sector. They're more widely shared. And we need those other people at the table really pulling their weight.
Awesome, thanks. So we're going to go to the questions on the floor. It's a little glamorous up here, so it's very hard to see you. So if you could
see you.
Yes, excellent. So if you could share your name, that would be awesome. And a question, and a two-part question is actually 2 questions, so just maybe 1. Thank you. It's not my first rodeo. And we'll start over here.
Thank you. I am Bernie Farber. I'm formerly the head of the Canadian Jewish Congress. I just want to say before I ask my question, this has been a fascinating panel, and the fact that we have young people with guts and determination and moxie really gives me a lot of heart. So, mazel tov to all you guys. You're fantastic. I kind of want to move this into a bit of a different direction, away from economics and into something that I find particularly onerous, and that is the whole issue of discrimination. Max, I don't have to tell you what First Nations people feel. I don't have to tell you what the issues around understanding history and genocide are all about. Whether it's in Europe, Johanna, or any place else, the issues of racism, discrimination are still with us in the 21st century. I believe that they impact even more on young people than they have probably even in my day, and that goes back a few years. So I'm curious as to what your, how you feel about it, number one, and what your experience has been with this whole issue of discrimination, how it's impacted on trying to take your own issues forward. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. You know, the issue of discrimination, am I still on? Am I off? Oh, I'm just getting a little closer. Discrimination is an issue that we still struggle with. It's an issue I struggle with. When I was running for election the first time, I was in the business school, not to generalize business students, but I was walking away from a group of business students, and they said, was that Max FineDay? He's running for president? Oh, he'll put the Students' Union in third-party management if he wins. And it sort of took me aback. I said, that's really clever, and like, how do you know about third-party management? But, you know, like, it's clever, right? So we got to give him that. But the issue of discrimination is still something that we struggle with. I'm often painted as a one-issue sort of guy. I'm painted as the Aboriginal voice, the First Nations voice. When I start talking about the student experience, affordable, accessible education, open educational resources, student mental health issues, people are kind of taken aback. People often don't think I'm a voice of authority because I'm a young Aboriginal man. I still get stopped by the police in my city because I'm a young Aboriginal man. We have a long way to go, but here we are. I've been elected not once but twice now by the entire student population at the University of Saskatchewan. I think we're getting somewhere. We're not there yet, but I'm more hopeful for my generation because of these signs.
Thank you.
I'll be brief. One personal example, one professional example. I'm an immigrant. I arrived to Canada when I was 3, and I can tell you that my parents and I suffered from discrimination a lot. I was refused from a college for having a Latino accent. I was told like that, you cannot be admitted into our college because you have an accent. That's one example. On the professional side, our kids, the kids that we work with, face bullying and discrimination on a weekly basis, and I can tell you that it leads to many kids who drop out of school because they lose their self-esteem because of those attacks. So it does affect us at many levels.
And we only have about 10 minutes left. I'm just letting the folks of the people know.
Peter here. It's not only dropping out, they drop dead because of suicide.
Yeah.
As a gay man, I've seen too much of that. One of the good things the Ontario government is doing is anti-bullying education in the school curriculum, because to get back those safe schools so they can continue. It is incumbent upon arts and other organizations when they come out of that school, wherever they're volunteering, working part-time, that we establish anti-harassment and education policies. Because if we're going to have them do anti-bullying stuff in the high schools, it is incumbent that continue wherever they join the workplace or volunteer sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Bill Sundu. I'm from Kamloops, BC. My question relates to something that was just touched on briefly in your discussion, and that is why young people, millennials, are not voting and what impediments there are. I have some intellectual difficulty accepting that proposition. Just last week, there was a news story that Nanos research indicated that if young people had voted, people under 30, in just the same average number as the rest of Canadians, Stephen Harper and the Conservatives would have been deprived of a majority. It's not hard to vote. I understand issues about systemic barriers, but quite frankly, I think of my own mother and her immigrant friends. My mother's an immigrant. Her and her group of friends are completely uneducated women, never attended a day of school in their lives. All in their 80s got on the bus or arranged a ride and went with their walkers and their canes to vote in the last election in my province. So if they can do that, I have great difficulty accepting some of the excuses or rationale for not voting, because ultimately, and I'm just going to end, it's about political power and political influence. And if the younger generation voted, the priorities, issues that you talk about, presumably would be advanced somewhat. You'd have some influence. So what is it going to take to get young people to vote, and why don't they vote? Thank you.
Excellent. I did my master's on this, so let's sum it up in 5 minutes. Lightning round. Let's start with you, Sean. What's it going to take for young people to vote?
I think that there are actually solutions on the process of doing voting that we could have. For example, making it easier for people to vote at any polling station in their riding. There's so many barriers that people, particularly those who are migratory in school, that sort of thing, have in even finding their polling station and the voting information, that I think that would be a really simple thing that could go a long way.
I'm going to pick on parties a little bit. I think parties have to do more outreach. There needs to be a lot more outreach to young people and about issues that young people care about. I mean, the economy is a great thing, but when I'm watching the leaders debate, it's not my #1 thing that I want to hear about. I want to hear about investments in post-secondary education and the like. So I think we need to see a lot more of that. We've seen what doesn't turn young people on, so let's try something else.
It takes one thing, an inspirational leader. Look at what Jack Layton did to Quebec. We became orange across. Young people voted during that election because they wanted to see the change, and we got the change. Now we have no voice in Ottawa, but we got the change. So that's what it takes, an inspirational leader.
I hope it's not only because of an inspirational leader, and also because of raising alternatives. I think you have to make clear why it's important that you vote, because then something changes. So you have to make clear that if you vote for Party A, it's like this, and if you vote for Party B, it's like that. And of course, you have to raise questions on which young people are affected, so affect their daily life.
So it's an issue of access, it's an issue of people talking about issues that young people have. It's incumbent on the political parties to care about young people and to give them some alternatives. It would help if we had a charismatic leader of some sort at some point. Okay, there's 3 questions left. I would really like to accommodate them, but if you could jump right to the question right away. We'll start over here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Robin. I'm a student from Concordia. Contrary to how it was framed by one of your panelists, I found the Quebec student movement to be an example of a particularly meaningful movement against the privatization of education and making education accessible for everyone. So how can we change the conversation? Because when I was involved in the strike and went back to Ontario, I was very surprised to see how many people had this disdain for it. Thanks.
I think we're jealous in the rest of Canada. I mean, Quebec has the lowest tuition because they actually do something when it's getting raised. I just saw tuition go up another 4.5% at the University of Saskatchewan. It was met with shrugs and some angry Facebook posts. We know that students are busy, but we need to organize, and it's particularly on student activists to do some outreach themselves and try to organize people around these issues. Talk to your student body. I mean, if you can get someone to stop in the hall for 30 seconds and talk about the right to an education, that can do a lot.
I'm going to try and go to this question, but I just want to say we've been really hard on ourselves as millennials, but we haven't talked a lot about intergenerational organizing and what other folks can do in the room. So maybe at dinner time?
Amy Huziak, Canadian Labour Congress and former USSU member. Hello. So one of the things that I hear a lot about is the supposed skills gap that we have in Canada and the blaming of young Canadians for taking too many liberal arts degrees as to why we have this problem. But I live here in Ontario now, where we have 5 people looking for a job for every 1 job that's available. And so to me, that says there's a jobs gap, not a skills gap. And our solutions from the government so far seem to be in the form of more subsidized internships, which I don't think is going to be the solution. So my question to the panel is, can you just elaborate a little bit more on what you see some of the necessary components of quality job creation for young people in Canada being?
Okay. Yeah.
So absolutely. I think we just had a report from the PBO last week saying that the skills gap is, how do I put this politely, something that comes out of a bovine's back end. If there was a real skills gap, we would see things like wages shoot up in the industries where there's supposedly a skills gap, and we're not seeing that. I think what we really need to invest in are ways to create paid apprenticeship programs. I think we need more incentives, not just government incentives, but actual corporate incentives for companies to invest in long-term training. I don't think we often tie the issues of income inequality together with unemployment as much as we should, but it's this really short-term stock market performance that I think makes it very difficult for companies to make the case to their investors that they should really be investing in people long-term, rather than simply taking on ready-to-hire people right out the gate.
Thank you, Sean. Anybody else who wants to weigh in on this? Yeah, Gabriel?
Well, I mean, it sums up what I would have said, but I work in the field of science and technology, and for us, we work a lot with corporations like Bombardier to see how they can better integrate young people into their corporation on a long-term basis. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in those fields, and in many other fields where corporations need, skilled laborers. But, I mean, I don't want to, there's 3 minutes left, and it's a conversation that goes so
deep.
Beyond. Yeah, it's a very deep conversation that needs to be talked about. Maybe we need a panel about that.
Okay. There's an oracle giving me notes all the time, and I'm now going to ask the oracle if I can take one final question. I'm going to do it. Go for it. And then I have to wrap up. Yeah.
Stéphane Allard from PSAC. Just a quick point of clarification that the so-called protest surrounding a small increase in student tuition fees was actually a proposed increase of 82% by the Charest government at the time. What I don't consider to be a small increase. And the other point I wanted to make, less of a question than a comment, really, is that I think that what is being proposed in terms of self-employment and entrepreneurship is really just more of the same sort of rhetoric of deepening neoliberalism. It's not a long-term solution. We heard in an earlier panel earlier today, I believe that for every one successful startup, you've got 8 failures. I don't think that's for a demographic who's already precariously employed, that bankruptcy for 80% of people looking at startups is any sort of lasting solution either. And just as an overall comment, I think really that when we talk about youth, I think it's important to talk about society as a whole. I think that there'd be less youth unemployment if there was more security for older workers who could retire in dignity, if there was an increase in CPP, for example, and
thanks.
I think that we have to stop talking about youth unemployment. We have to talk about a social vision and a social project, and that includes people, all working people, up to and including retirement. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, it's obvious we could take this conversation really deep. There's a big diversity of opinions. Unfortunately, some of our panelists have to leave right away, but some of them will be around for the rest of the weekend. Please, I encourage you to come talk to them. This is the idea that we're sharing. It's an abundance of ideas, and I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon.